Do you like true crime? Do you also like to laugh? What about desperate ruminations on mortality, existence, and whether there's any meaning in the world? If you like all those things, or hell, even just one, join myself, Alex Stapula, and my longtime friend Lena Berry, and listen to our podcast, Give Me Murder or Give Me Death. Cannibalism, necrophilia, serial killers, and above all, fun. If you've got a dark sense of humor, we won't disappoint you. But even if we do disappoint you, we're all gonna die someday. Oh, and I've got a killer German accent. Check out Give Me Murder or Give Me Death wherever you find your podcasts.
Welcome to No Better Death, the podcast that knows while you can die no better death than your own, that doesn't mean we can't take a look for the unusual and noteworthy in the deaths of others. Each episode will take an in-depth look at some out-of-the-ordinary deaths and the events surrounding them. This show will contain explicit language and graphic details. I'm your host, Sick Grayson. What's up, everybody out there in podcast land? How are you doing? I can't complain. The family's doing fairly well. Any day I haven't gotten fired is a good one, and the Crimbus shopping is finally done. I hate buying presents for other people, figuring out what they want or what they would like, going to the store, all of it. Wrapping them. I hate wrapping presents. I'm a bag guy. I put everything in a bag, tape it up, slap a bow on it, good to go. Way easier than wrapping, but my wife says opening a present in a bag doesn't feel the same as unwrapping a present. Something about being able to unwrap it truly makes it a present. I guess I'm not much for aesthetics and whatnot. Function over form or fashion, just get the job done. But I guess I'll be wrapping the last of these presents. But all the shopping's done, and I think I managed to get everybody something they won't absolutely hate, at least. I only have one headline, and then we'll get into the meat of the show. James Fields, the piece of shit that drove his car into a crowd of protesters in Charlottesville, killing one woman and injuring dozens of others, was found guilty of murder after about 7 hours of deliberation. Multiple victims testified at the hearing, ensuring a guilty verdict, and sentencing is set for December 17th. So around the time this episode goes up, he should either be about to go in for sentencing or have already been sentenced. Currently, he faces 20 years to life for the crimes themselves, and that could turn into a death penalty if the federal hate crime charges to be determined later actually stick. So let's hope for that. Let's hope this is treated as a hate crime so he can get the harshest punishment possible. But until then, we at least know dude will be in the pen for 20 years minimum and most likely longer. Whatever annual winter festivities you participate in, whether it's Christmas, Saturnalia, Kwanzaa, Hanukkah, Festivus for the rest of us, the common denominator is all those festivities take place in December, a time of celebration, relaxation, and spending time with those that we hold dear. It's also a month with one of the highest death tolls in America, and December 25th specifically sees more deaths in American hospitals than on any other day. Fortunately, none of these stories takes place in a hospital. One person will end up in a hospital, but the following 4 stories do end in death, and all 4 of them take place on December 25th, the day most people in America consider Christmas. Though I just prefer to call it Crimbus, which can mean whatever you want it to mean or absolutely nothing at all. We're going to start by taking a look at the story of Johnny Ace, a musician whose rise to fame would be cut short before it truly had a chance to start. John Marshall Alexander Jr., aka Johnny Ace, was born June 9, 1929 in Memphis, Tennessee. How Memphis was he? His daddy was a preacher, and it don't get much more Memphis than that. After serving in the U.S. Navy during the Korean War, John joined Adolph Duncan's band as a pianist. Sometime later, he joined the B.B. King Band. A short time after joining, B.B. King would leave for L.A., and singer Bobby Bland would enlist in the Army, leaving John to take over the vocals and rename the band the Beale Streeters. So John took over B.B. King's band and his radio show on WDIA and began going by the moniker Johnny Ace. In 1952, he supposedly recorded 2 songs for legendary Memphis label Sun Records, but they were lost and it's kind of hard to substantiate those. But supposedly they were recorded and then the recordings just got lost. That same year, he signed a deal with Duke Records. His first recording, My Song, topped the charts for 9 weeks that September and would go on to be covered by Aretha Franklin in 1968. John began touring heavily, often with Willie Mae Thornton, and had 8 hits in a row over the next 2 years, including Saving My Love for You, The Clock, Please Forgive Me, Never Let Me Go, and more. In December 1954, he was named the most programmed artist of 1954, and what that means is he got more radio play than any other artist in the country in 1954, and that's a big accomplishment. Just 3 of his recordings that year sold more than 1.75 million copies. That's a lot of single sales for the 1950s. February 1955 would see his newest single, Pledging My Love, hit number 1 on the charts and stay there for 10 weeks. It would have been cause for celebration, but sadly, Johnny wasn't around to see it, as he had died by a self-inflicted gunshot wound on Christmas Day, 1954. Rumor had it that he killed himself during a game of Russian roulette, but witnesses say different. Johnny was known to carry a small .32 caliber pistol that he would often play with or shoot at street signs from the car as they drove between gigs. On Christmas Day, after enjoying a large meal with his band at his girlfriend Olivia's house, and less than 2 hours after buying a brand new 1955 Oldsmobile, he was playing with his pistol between sets at the City Auditorium in Houston, Texas, where a crowd of 3,500 people had gathered to see him, Big Mama, Johnny Otis, and headliner B.B. King. Intermission began around 11 p.m. Johnny was still pranking around in the dressing room backstage drinking vodka, but not in his finest spirits as he had been in earlier that day. Now he was grousing about a toothache that was killing him. Even though thousands of fans were in the auditorium waiting for the second half of the show, he said he didn't think he could go on. There were 4 other people in and out of the room. Olivia Gibbs, his girlfriend, was there, along with her friend Mary Carter. So was another singer named Joe Hammond and Big Mama Thornton. Olivia crawled up onto Johnny's lap to try to make him feel better. All the while, Johnny Ace was playing with his little .32 caliber pistol, pointing it at people in the room and pulling the trigger. With no bullet in the firing chamber, every time he pulled the trigger, the gun made a snapping sound. Snap, snap! He was starting to get on people's nerves. Big Mama Thornton, all 6 feet of her, finally had enough. "Hey man, what the heck you doing with that gun? Don't you know it might go off?" "It ain't got but 1 bullet in it," Johnny said. "Hell, it don't take but 1 bullet to kill you," Big Mama replied, snatching the pistol. She turned the chamber and a bullet tumbled into her hand. She took a swig of 100-proof Old Granddad and headed out toward her second set. "Give me the gun," Johnny demanded as she neared the door. She handed it over. "You ain't gonna play with it no more, is you?" "Where's the bullet?" he said. She threw it at him. Snap! Now Johnny pointed the gun at Joe Hammond. Snap! Snap! This got on Joe Hammond's last nerve. "Damn," Joe spat. "You snapped it at everyone else. Try it on yourself." "Okay. Now watch me," said Johnny. "Show you it won't shoot." Johnny Ace had his arm around Olivia. He placed the gun to his temple. He pulled the trigger one more time. Bang! Johnny Ace fell to the floor. Big Mama stopped dead in her tracks. "I thought he was just up to his usual playing until I raised his head and saw the blood," Olivia recalled. Olivia was lucky that Johnny Ace was playing with a small caliber revolver and that the bullet didn't pass all the way through his brain. When he pulled the trigger, he was hugging her close. Her head was pressed right up against his. None of the thousands in the auditorium had heard the gunshot because Johnny Otis and his band were on stage playing at the time. They were in the middle of a number when Big Mama came running onto stage in tears and grabbed the microphone. "The concert is canceled. Johnny Ace has just been killed. There ain't gonna be no music tonight. Johnny Ace has been killed." The Associated Press story was carried in newspapers around the country the following day. A Memphis, Tennessee band leader was shot to death playing Russian roulette last night, which of course was not true. A second source gives a slightly different take on the story, but with an identical outcome. Big Mama Thornton's bass player Curtis Tillman says he was also in the room. Johnny Ace had been drinking and he had this little pistol and he was waving it around the table and someone said, "Be careful with that thing." And then he said, "It's okay, gun's not loaded, see?" And he pointed it at himself with a smile on his face and bang. Sad, sad thing. Big Mama ran out of the dressing room yelling Johnny Ace just killed himself. Johnny's funeral was held January 2nd, 1955 in Memphis and was attended by 5,000 people and overseen by Reverend/blues musician Dwight Gatemouth Moore. His remains were interred at New Park Cemetery. Billboard magazine stated Ace's death created one of the biggest demands for a record since the death of Hank Williams just 2 years earlier. Johnny's singles were compiled into the album The Johnny Ace Memorial Album. In the years that followed, his songs would be covered by Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Elvis, David Allan Coe, and others. His songs would be featured in movies by Martin Scorsese, John Carpenter, and Robert Zemeckis, and countless other musicians, including Paul Simon, Harry Hepcat, and Squirrel Nut Zippers, would go on to write songs about Johnny and his death. In my opinion, a life cut far too short over a stupid thing, but it often seems like those are the people who are truly remembered, canonized in their youth by brash or foolish decisions. Would he have been as revered if he lived to be 70 years old and died in his sleep? I mean, would Kurt Cobain be the icon he is if he had never died? Would we remember Jimi Hendrix the way we do had he not OD'd at such a young age? Who knows? We see it every day. A musician or actor or author or painter dies at 90 and it's a half-page article on MSN.com, but we know full well had that same artist died 60 years earlier, it would have been a headline in every magazine and paper around the first world. It's unfortunate, but I can't say tragic. A grown-ass man playing with a gun, he knew what could happen, everyone warned him, he didn't listen and he blew his face off. Guns. Don't fucking play with them. From 1950s southern U.S., we go to the mid-2000s Japan to talk about Hiroaki Hidaka, taxi driving serial killer with a body count of 4. Hidaka was born in the Miyazaki Prefecture, which is just an area of a specific island in Japan. He was an excellent student, but couldn't get into his first choice college, University of Tsukuba. He enrolled in Fukuoka University instead, but eventually dropped out. He often borrowed money, drank, and went to prostitutes. In April 1989, he moved to Hiroshima and began to work as a taxi driver. Hidaka married in 1991 and had a daughter in 1993, but at some point, and I couldn't verify when, his wife went into a mental hospital, and I couldn't find really any other information about Hidaka, his daughter, or his wife. Usually these Asian countries don't leak a lot of it, keep things to themselves, so it's kind of hard to find any real information about him. What we do know is sometime between 93 and 96, his wife went to a mental hospital, and between April and September of 96, he killed and robbed 4 women. One of his victims was a 16-year-old girl who engaged in injo kosai, or compensated dating, which might but doesn't necessarily include sexual activity. His MO seemed to be strangling the women, robbing them, and dumping the bodies. He was arrested on September 21st, 1996. The district court in Hiroshima sentenced Hidaka to death on February 9th, 2000, a sentence that he did not appeal. He was executed by hanging on December 25, 2006. After his execution, his lawyer protested that he had been illegally refused access to his client by prison authorities. And this is where we get to the real story. Keep in mind, we're talking about deaths on Christmas, and while any serial killer story is interesting and fits the overall theme of no better death, what makes Hidaka relevant to this episode is that he was executed on Christmas Day, 2006. Even then, the relevancy here isn't specific to him. He was executed along with 3 others that day. So what's the twist in the story? It seems that none of the men executed that day knew ahead of time that they were going to die. They were on death row, but they had no execution date in sight. 2 of these dudes were so old they were in wheelchairs and needed help getting into the noose. The bulk of what follows is from an article in Japan Times, and the link is in the show notes if you want to check it out. The Justice Ministry sent 4 death row inmates to the gallows Monday, inflaming lawyers and protesters over the first executions to be carried out in 15 months. Justice Minister Jinin Nagase's rare Christmas Day approval sealed the fates of Yoshimitsu Akiyama, 77 and wheelchair-bound, Yoshio Fujinami, 75, also in a wheelchair, Michio Fukuoka, 64, and Hiroaki Hidaka, 44. They were the first hangings since September 2005, and it was the first time more than 3 went to the gallows on a single day since August 1997. Akiyama was put to death for the 1975 slaying of a woman who ran a plastics processing firm. He struck her in the head and fled with 10 million yen of her money to repay debts. He also tried to run his wife down after taking out life insurance on her. His death penalty was finalized in 1987. Fujinami was hanged for murdering 2 relatives in March 1981 at his former brother-in-law's home after they refused to tell him where his ex-wife was. He also seriously injured the brother-in-law's 2 nieces and robbed the house of 7 million yen. His death penalty was confirmed in 1993. Fukuoka strangled his wife's sister in September 1978 and took 570,000 yen from her bank account. To conceal the murder, in April 1980, he killed a bar hostess who helped him murder the woman. In January 1981, he killed his father-in-law and took 230,000 yen. His punishment was finalized in 1999. Hidaka, a taxi driver, strangled a 16-year-old girl in his car, took 45,000 yen from her, and dumped her body in Hiroshima in April 1996. Likewise, he killed 3 other women aged 23 to 45 between August and September that year. His penalty was finalized in 2000. The Justice Ministry released a short statement confirming 4 executions but did not disclose the victims' names or other details, citing government policy. Amnesty International Japan got the detailed information about the inmates and distributed it to media. Lawmakers and opponents of capital punishment were quick to react against Nagase's controversial decision. I am very disappointed that executions took place, Social Democratic Party leader Fukushima told a Tokyo news conference, adding she just met with Nagase on December 19th and had urged him not to approve any executions. The death sentences were carried out in a rush and no prior announcements were made, she said. Nobuto Hosaka of the Social Democratic Party denounced the hangings, claiming Fujinami and Akiyama were in the process of appealing for a retrial. It's Christmas, a special day even for those who are not Christians. I can't understand why they chose to carry out the executions, he said, pointing out that the hangings took place less than a week after the extraordinary diet session closed. Hosaka suggested Nagase acted during the legislative recess to avoid coming under questioning by opposing politicians. I realize a majority of Japanese support the death penalty, but that is why there needs to be more debate on the issue, Hosaka said. Makoto Taranaka, Secretary General of Amnesty International Japan, also voiced dismay. We had been asking the Justice Ministry not to carry out the death penalty, he said. Taranaka suggested Nagase merely didn't want to be the one to break the unbroken record of carrying out at least 1 hanging every calendar year since 1993, adding his support for capital punishment in light of the feelings of the victims and for maintaining order in society. The criminal procedure law states that an execution must take place within 6 months after a death sentence is finalized, but Nagase's predecessor, Seiken Sugiura, I'm probably butchering that, a devout Buddhist, did not sign any death warrants during his 11-month stint as justice minister. With the 4 hangings, 94 prisoners remain on death row awaiting the execution order, which only the minister can issue. Japan and the U.S. remain the only major industrialized nations that have capital punishment. So basically, the head of Japan's version of the Department of Justice woke up on Christmas and said, "It's a good day for dying. For other people, not for me. Call the prisons and tell them to execute these motherfuckers." So these 4 guys, thinking it's just going to be another Crimbus and the Clink, get yanked out of their cells and drug off to the gallows and hung. One article I read said they had about a 2-hour notice and no contact with legal counsel or relatives before the execution. And what do you think? Do you deserve notice? Did they deserve a chance to speak to a lawyer or tell their families goodbye? They did murder people in the coldest of blood. Murder for money is one of the most despicable reasons. You know, they were convicted killers living on the taxpayers' teat, and they knew this was coming at some point, just not that specific day. So was it wrong for the government to have them executed with no notice, or did they deserve to know when they were going to be executed so they could get their affairs in order? And what about the fact that of all industrialized, quote-unquote, first world countries, only America and Japan still sentence people to death? I always struggle with that one, the death penalty in general, you know? Do we have the right to kill those who have killed? Those that are beyond repair? I mean, some people can't be fixed. Your Jeffrey Dahmers, your Richard Ramirez's, there's no rehabilitating people like that, so they have to be separated from the rest of society. That's just fact. But beyond that, how much of a right does society and the justice system have to decide the fate of those criminals? Do you ground them for life and force law-abiding taxpayers to spend millions upon millions of dollars on housing, feeding, clothing, and providing medical care for the murderers? Wouldn't that money be better used for education, social services, public safety, healthcare, any number of things that could be improved in this country? I mean, I'd rather that money go to NASA shooting cameras to Mars instead of paying to fix Gary Ridgway's teeth or whatever those dollars go to. I pay $13,000 a year in taxes with no return, and the possibility that a single penny of my money could somehow end up going towards something like the Golden State Killer's legal defense does piss me off. But I also don't know if we have any right to say, okay, well, you have to die now. You killed people, you're in trouble, your punishment is for us to do to you what you did to them. There is a level of hypocrisy there and of making calls I don't know are ours to make that does conflict with the common sense of, well, yeah, they killed people. If you let them out, they would kill more people. And as long as you ground them in this little room, you're going to have to subsidize their entire existence. It's a real tricky subject, man. But I do think just yanking some people out of bed on Christmas morning and being like, okay, we're killing you in 2 hours, that's a little harsh. But anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent. 4 fuckers hung on Christmas in Japan, the end. Now it's time for 5 fast facts about Krimbus. A Christmas legend from Iceland was so horrific that the government eventually banned parents from telling the children's tale. In the days leading up to Christmas, the Yule lads were said to appear for the sole purpose of making children's lives more difficult. The descendants of monsters, each of these 13 creatures had a unique method for wreaking havoc. One might steal milk and farm animals, whereas another would remove all light sources from a room, leaving traumatized children in total darkness. As unsettling as the Yule lads were, the group's pet was infinitely worse. The lads were followed around by a ferocious cat whose diet consisted entirely of children. Unlike Krampus, this cat doesn't care if you've been naughty or nice. It's hungry for whatever it can get its teeth on. 2. Most people have seen some version of the Nutcracker. However, many are not aware that this beloved holiday staple was written and based on an E.T.A. Hoffmann book written in 1816. In the fairy tale, a young girl named Marie falls in love with the Nutcracker Prince, who she can only see come to life when she's asleep. During a battle between the Nutcracker Prince and the Mouse King, Marie cuts her arm and falls into a feverish sleep. There, she gets brainwashed by the Mouse King. After Marie recounts the story to her family, they forbid her from speaking about her dreams. Nonetheless, Marie's faithful love for the Nutcracker brings the ugly doll to life once again. She and the Nutcracker Prince leave Marie's world and choose instead to live in the Doll Kingdom. Basically, the Nutcracker is a story about a young girl who falls in love with a doll, then leaves her old family and life to spend her days with said doll in a world where toys are constantly warring with mice and child marriage laws apparently do not exist. Clearly, it's a wonderfully inspiring Christmas story. 3. While A Christmas Carol is perhaps the most famous Christmas-time ghost story in the United States, the tradition of Christmas ghost stories predates Ebenezer Scrooge and Marley's Ghost. As is the case with many Christmas traditions, telling ghost stories around Christmas time dates back to pagan customs. Around the time of the winter solstice, the pagans celebrate the festival of Yule. During this period, they believe that the colder, darker days made the spirits of the dead more accessible to the living. This history of pagan customs helps explain the relevancy of ghost stories to the Christian holiday, but the connection still seems odd. During the holiest days of the year, we scare the hell out of children with stories like that of Ebenezer Scrooge, a greedy loner who is forced to face ghosts that can manipulate his perception of time and space. 4. One Catalonian tradition is the Caganer, a Christmas statue found in nativity scenes in Andorra and parts of Spain, Italy, and Portugal. The scenes depict the entire town of Bethlehem, and the Caganer, or is that Caganer? I'm assuming it's Caganer, C-A-G-A-N-E-R. The Caganer is usually tucked away in the corner, far from Mary and Joseph. The Caganer needs privacy because he's shitting. There are quite a few explanations for this custom, but none have been confirmed as the original source. Caganers have been used for at least a couple hundred years. You can even buy Caganers that resemble modern-day celebrities. Just a dude pooping in a corner somewhere in the nativity. Interesting. 5. The celebration of Christmas in Asia usually involves imported Western traditions, but in Japan those traditions have been shaped by commercial interests. The holiday places a special emphasis on romantic love, so it's a day to spend with a sweetheart or spouse, so it's more like Valentine's Day. Bakeries sell Christmas cakes as traditional sweetheart treats, and you might have to make reservations to get a table at KFC. Yup, KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken. The fast food franchise let it be known that fried chicken is traditional for the Christmas feast, and so it is, in Japan. And it's really weird. I was a manager at KFC back in the day, and this has been verified. At some point in like the 60s or 70s, KFC went to Japan and said, hey, this is what Americans eat on a big American Christmas, and actually worked up this hype to where KFC and Christmas are just linked to people in Japan. They place orders for their buckets week in advance just to make sure they aren't sold out or waiting in line all day on Christmas. I mean, do they not have Boston Market or Cracker Barrel in Japan? Those would come way closer to a traditional American Christmas meal than a bucket of KFC. And that is the 5 fast facts about Christmas. So, from a blues musician to a Japanese serial killer, and now on to a Romanian communist dictator. Nicolae Ceausescu was the General Secretary of the Romanian Communist Party from 1965 to 1989, and hence the second and last communist leader of Romania. He was also the country's head of state, serving President of the State Council and President of the Republic until his overthrow in the Romanian Revolution, December 1989, part of a series of anti-communist and anti-Soviet Union uprisings in Eastern Europe that year. Born in 1918, one of 9 children in a poor family that got by on farming and tailor work, Nicolae ran away from his extremely religious and abusive father at 11 years old and went to Bucharest, where he found work as a shoemaker's apprentice. His boss got him involved with the Romanian Communist Youth Movement. Ceausescu rose up through the ranks of, and I'm probably going to butcher this too, you guys know I'm not very good with foreign names, George Georgiou Dej. Anyway, Ceausescu rose up through, I'm just going to call him Dej. Ceausescu rose up through Dej's socialist government, which seized power in 1947. Upon Dej's death in 1965, Ceausescu was not the obvious successor despite his closeness to the longtime leader. However, widespread infighting by older and more connected officials made the Politburo, which was kind of the governing body of Romania, turn to Ceausescu as a compromise candidate. He was elected General Secretary on March 22, 1965, 3 days after Dej's death. Upon his rise to power, Nicolae eased press censorship and openly condemned the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia in his speech on August 21, 1968, which resulted in a surge in popularity. The resulting period of stability was very brief, however. His government soon became severely totalitarian and was considered the most repressive in Eastern Europe. His secret police were responsible for mass surveillance as well as severe repression and human rights abuses within the country, and he suppressed and controlled the media and press, implementing methods that were among the harshest, most restrictive, and brutal in the world. Economic mismanagement due to failed oil ventures during the 1970s led to skyrocketing foreign debts for Romania. In 1982, Nicolae exported much of the country's agricultural and industrial production in an effort to repay those debts. The shortages that followed drastically lowered living standards in Romania, leading to heavy rationing of food, water, oil, heat, electricity, medicine, and other necessities. And see, I looked into this part. He had this plan to build oil refineries during the 70s oil crisis in an attempt to make Romania this oil kingpin. But what he hadn't counted on was the fact that Romanian workers were very unproductive and the refineries were either never finished or finished far behind schedule. He was paying for them with loans from other countries while he was spending Romania's real money on charitable donations to third world countries in an attempt to buy worldwide influence. So he bankrupted the country trying to buy this influence and then ran it into debt with all these loans that he couldn't repay. And his best idea to try to repay them was to sell the country's entire gross domestic product at a loss to try to get some money coming back into the country. And this is bad ideas all around. Any basic community college educated accountant or banker will tell you this was a shitty idea. Meanwhile, his hangers-on experienced unprecedented elevation. Him and his homies were living it up like ballers, followed by extensive nepotism and an intense deterioration of foreign relations, even with the Soviet Union. Yeah, when the USSR is looking at other communist leaders like, you're a liability, you suck at your job. In November 1989, the Congress of the Romanian Communist Party saw Ceausescu, then age 71, re-elected for another 5 years as leader of the PCR. During that Congress, Ceausescu made a speech denouncing the anti-communist revolutions happening throughout the rest of Eastern Europe. The following month, his government itself collapsed after a series of violent events in Timisoara and Bucharest. Demonstrations in the city of Timisoara were triggered by the government-sponsored attempt to evict Laszlo Tokes, an ethnic Hungarian pastor accused by the government of inciting ethnic hatred. Members of his ethnic Hungarian congregation surrounded his apartment in a show of support. Romanian students spontaneously joined the demonstration, which soon lost nearly all connection to its initial cause and became a more general anti-government demonstration. Regular military forces, police, and the secret police fired on demonstrators on December 17, 1989, killing and injuring men, women, and children. The mass meeting on December 21st, held in what is now called Revolution Square, began like many of Ceausescu's speeches over the years. He spoke of the achievements of the socialist revolution and Romanian multilaterally developed socialist society. He also blamed the Timisoara riots on fascist agitators who want to destroy socialism. However, Ceausescu had misjudged the crowd's mood. Roughly 8 minutes into his speech, several people began jeering and booing, and others began chanting, "Timisoara, Timisoara." He tried to silence them by raising his right hand and calling for the crowd's attention before order was temporarily restored, then proceeded to announce social benefit reforms that included raising the national minimum wage by $200 per month to a total of $2,200 per month by January 1st of the following year. Images of Ceausescu's facial expression as the crowd began to boo and heckle him were among the most widely broadcast during the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. Failing to control the crowds, the Ceausescus finally took cover inside the building that housed the Central Committee of the Romanian Communist Party. The rest of the day saw an open revolt of Bucharest's population, which had assembled in University Square and confronted the police and army at barricades. The rioters were no match for the military, which cleared the streets by midnight and arrested hundreds of people in the process. By the morning of December 22nd, the rebellion had already spread to all major cities across the country. The suspicious death of Vasil Malea, Ceausescu's defense minister, later confirmed as a suicide, was announced by the media. Immediately thereafter, Ceausescu presided over the CPX Political Executive Committee, meeting and assured the leadership of the army. Believing that Malaya had been murdered, rank-and-file soldiers switched sides to the revolution en masse. The commanders wrote off Ceausescu as a lost cause and made no effort to keep their men loyal to the government. So the army turned on him, because they thought he killed this guy. And it was later confirmed that this guy just tried to somehow, it said incapacitate himself. Basically, he wanted a medical reason to not have to participate on either side of this rioting. But in trying to flesh wound himself, he severed an artery and died. But the military didn't know that. They thought Ceausescu had him murdered, so they've switched sides over to the rioters. Now this guy's fucked. He has no military backing him up. He only has a few bodyguards. Ceausescu made a last desperate attempt to address the crowd gathered in front of the Central Committee building, but the people in the square began throwing stones and other projectiles at him, forcing him to take refuge in the building once again. One group of protesters forced open the doors to the building, by now left unprotected. They managed to overpower Ceausescu's bodyguards and rush through his office and onto the balcony. Although they did not know it, they were only a few meters from Ceausescu, who was trapped in an elevator. He, his wife Elena, and 4 others managed to get to the roof and escape by helicopter, only seconds ahead of a group of demonstrators who had followed him there. The Romanian Communist Party disappeared soon afterward. Unlike its kindred parties in the former Soviet bloc, it has never been revived. During the course of the revolution, the Western press published estimates of the number of people killed by the secret police forces in an attempt to support Ceausescu and quell the rebellion. The count increased rapidly until an estimated 64,000 fatalities were widely reported across the front pages. The Hungarian military attaché expressed doubt regarding these figures, pointing out that the unfeasible logistics of killing such a large number of people in such a short period of time. After Ceausescu's death, hospitals across the country reported a death toll of fewer than 1,000 and probably much lower than that. Ceausescu and his wife Elena fled to the capital with Emil Bobu and Minea Menescu and headed by helicopter for Ceausescu's residence, whence they fled again, this time for another city. And near the next city they jumped to, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce, they abandoned the helicopter, having been ordered to land by the army. They're following this guy. They're trying to take him down. The Ceausescus were held by the police while the policemen listened to the radio. They were eventually turned over to the army. On Christmas Day, 1989, in a small room, the Ceausescus were tried before a court convened on orders of the National Salvation Front, Romania's provisional government, and charged with illegal gathering of wealth and genocide. Ceausescu repeatedly denied the court's authority to try him and asserted he was still legally the president of Romania. At the end of the quick show trial, the Ceausescus were found guilty and sentenced to death. A soldier standing guard in the proceedings was ordered to take them outside and shoot them, but the Ceausescus demanded to die together. The soldiers agreed to this and began to tie their hands behind their backs, which the Ceausescus protested against but were powerless to prevent. They were executed by a gathering of soldiers. Captain Ionel Boru, Sergeant Major Gorgon Octavian, and Doran Marian Surlan, while reportedly hundreds of others also volunteered. So people were lining up to shoot this guy and his wife. The firing squad began shooting as soon as the two were positioned against the wall. A TV crew who were to film the execution only managed to catch the end of it as the Ceausescus lay on the ground shrouded by dust kicked up by the bullets striking the wall and the ground around them. Before his sentence was carried out, Ceausescu sang the Internationale while being led up against the wall. I guess that's their national anthem. After the shooting, the bodies were covered with canvas. The hasty show trial and the images of the dead Ceausescus were videotaped and the footage promptly released in numerous Western countries 2 days after the execution. Later that day, it was also shown on Romanian television. The manner in which the trial was conducted was widely criticized inside and outside Romania. However, Romania's provisional president said in 2009 that the trial was quite shameful but necessary in order to end the state of near anarchy that had gripped the country in the 3 days leading up to the trial, and that the alternative would have been seeing the Ceausescus lynched on the streets of Bucharest. The Ceausescus were the last people to be executed in Romania before the abolition of capital punishment on January 7, 1990. So these people didn't get to waste any time reforming everything. They just went in, took this dude out, immediately established a government, and promptly banned the death penalty. The Ceausescus were originally buried in simple graves at a cemetery in Bucharest on opposite sides of a path. Their graves were often decorated with flowers and symbols of communist rule. In April 2007, their son, Valentin Ceausescu, lost an appeal for an investigation into whether the graves were genuine. Upon his death in 1996, the younger son, Nicu, was buried nearby in the same cemetery. According to Journal National, requests were made by the Ceausescu's daughter Zoya and by supporters of their political views to move their remains to mausoleums or to purpose-built churches. These demands were also denied by the government. However, in July 2010, forensic scientists exhumed the bodies to perform DNA tests to prove conclusively that they were indeed the remains of the Ceausescus. The body believed to be Elena's had decayed too much to allow for a positive identification, but Nikolai was easily identifiable, wearing the bullet-riddled black winter coat he had been wearing when he was killed. So they didn't even put him in a funeral suit. They just straight shot him to death and put him in a box. DNA was able to conclusively prove his identity. His family organized a funeral service for the couple, and they were reburied together at the same cemetery under a modest tombstone. And I bet nobody else tried to pull some shit like that ever again in Romania. Look what the people were able to accomplish when they worked together against the real enemy rather than allowing themselves to be separated and forced to infighting with each other, which allowed the real enemy to continue oppressing them. Crazy, huh? What can happen when people get together and start looking out for their own best interests? One more story for the holiday horrors, taking it back to the 1950s South where we started this episode. We're going to talk about the death of civil rights pioneer Harry T. Moore. Harry Tyson Moore was born on November 18, 1905 in Houston, Florida, a tiny farming community in Suwannee County. He was the only child of Johnny and Rosa Moore. His father tended the water tanks for the Seaboard Airline Railroad and ran a small store in front of the house. Johnny started having health issues when Harry was 9 years old and died later that year in 1914. His widow Rosa tried to manage alone, working in the cotton fields and running the small store on weekends. In 1915, Rosa sent Harry to live with one of her sisters in Daytona Beach. The following year, he moved to Jacksonville, where he lived for the next 3 years with 3 other aunts, Jessie, Adriana, and Macy Tyson, who shared a household. This would prove to be the most important period in his formative years. Jacksonville had a large and vibrant African American community with a proud tradition of independence and intellectual achievement. Moore's aunts were educated, well-informed women. 2 were teachers and 1 was a nurse, who took this spindly, intelligent boy into their house on Louisiana Street and treated him like the son they'd never had. Under their nurturing guidance, Moore's natural inquisitiveness and love of learning were reinforced. After 3 years in Jacksonville, he returned home to Suwannee County in 1919 and enrolled in the high school program of Florida Memorial College. Over the next 4 years, Moore excelled in his studies and he was nicknamed Doc by his classmates. In May 1925, at age 19, he graduated from Florida Memorial College with a normal degree for teaching in the elementary grades and accepted a teaching job in Cocoa, Florida, in the watery wilderness of Brevard County. For the next 2 years, Moore taught 4th grade at Cocoa's only black elementary school. During his first year in Brevard County, he met Harriet Vinda Sims, an attractive older woman. She was 23 while he was barely 20. She had taught school herself, but was then selling insurance for the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, a major black-owned business. Within a year, they were married on Christmas Day, 1926. Double tragic, right? So we know this episode is about deaths on Christmas, and this guy's gonna die on his anniversary. Both the Moores completed college degrees at Bethune-Cookman College, a historically black college in Daytona Beach. The Sims family lived in Mims, a small citrus town outside the county seat of Titusville. The newlyweds moved in with Harriet's parents until they built their own house on an adjoining acre of land. Meanwhile, Harry had been promoted to principal of the Titusville Colored School, which went from 4th through 9th grades. He taught 9th grade and supervised a staff of 6 teachers. On March 28, 1928, their eldest daughter, Annie Rosalia, nicknamed Peaches, was born. When Peaches was 6 months old, Harriet began teaching at the Mims Colored School. On September 3, 1930, their baby daughter, Juanita Evangeline, was born. Both their daughters also earned college degrees at Bethune-Cookman College. Peaches died before the couple was murdered in late 1951. Juanita died in October 2015. In 1934, soon after the birth of their daughters, the Moores founded the Brevard County chapter of the NAACP. Moore also helped organize the statewide NAACP organization. Through his registration activities, he greatly increased the number of members, and he worked on issues of housing and education. He investigated lynchings, filed lawsuits against voter registration barriers and white primaries. He also worked for equal pay for black teachers in public schools, although they were segregated. In 1946, both the Moores were fired from their teaching jobs because of their activism. Harry Moore was working to gain equal pay for black public school teachers in the Brevard County segregated school system. Such economic retaliation was widely used in southern states to discourage activism. Harry Moore accepted a paid position with the NAACP in order to survive economically. Moore also led the Progressive Voters League, following a 1944 U.S. Supreme Court ruling against white primaries as unconstitutional. Between 1944 and 1950, Moore succeeded in increasing the registration of black voters in Florida to 31% of those eligible to vote, markedly higher than in any other southern state. In July 1949, 4 black men were accused of raping a white woman in Groveland, Florida. Ernest Thomas fled the county and was killed by a posse. The other 3 suspects were arrested and beaten while in custody, forcing 2 to confess. Rumors accompanied the case of a background of post-war tensions resulting from problems in absorbing veterans into jobs in American society. In Groveland, a white mob of more than 400 demanded that the sheriff, Willis McCall, who had hidden the prisoners to protect them, hand the prisoners over for lynching. The mob left the jail and went on a rampage, burning buildings in the black district of town. McCall asked the governor to send in the National Guard, but 6 days were needed to restore order. The 3 young men, one 16 years of age, were found guilty by an all-white jury. The judge sentenced the 16-year-old Charles Greenlee to life in prison. Sam Shepard and Walter Irving were sentenced to death. Executive Director of the Florida NAACP, Harry Moore, organized a campaign against what he saw as the wrongful convictions of the 3 men. With NAACP support, appeals were pursued. In April 1951, a legal team headed by Thurgood Marshall won the appeal of Shepard and Irvin's convictions before the U.S. Supreme Court. A new trial was scheduled. County Sheriff McCall was responsible for transporting Shepard and Irvin to the new trial venue in November 1951. He claimed that the 2 men, both handcuffed, attacked him in an escape attempt. He shot them both, and Shepard died at the scene. Irvin survived his wounds. He later claimed to NAACP and FBI officials that the sheriffs shot both him and Shepard in cold blood. Moore called for an indictment against Sheriff McCall and called on Florida Governor Fuller Warren to suspend McCall from office. 6 weeks later, on Christmas night, 1951, on the Moores' 25th wedding anniversary, a bomb went off beneath the couple's house in Mims, Florida. Both were fatally injured. Moore died on the way to the Black Hospital in Sanford, Florida, which was about 30 miles away but was the closest to serve African Americans. His wife died from her injuries 9 days later at the same hospital in Sanford. Moore has been called the first martyr in the civil rights movement. He was the first NAACP official assassinated in the civil rights struggle. He and his wife were the first couple to be killed for civil rights. The murders caused a national and international outcry, with protests registered at the United Nations against violence in the South. The NAACP held a huge rally in New York and in other cities too. In many respects, the protests over the Moores murders were a forerunner of demonstrations during the civil rights movement. The NAACP sponsored a fundraising event at Madison Square Garden where a song titled "The Ballad of Harry Moore" was performed, with lyrics by the renowned poet Langston Hughes. The state of Florida called for the FBI to head the investigation, but the case was never solved and no one was ever prosecuted. The FBI was convinced that the KKK had committed the bombing and identified a number of local Klansmen as suspects, but was never able to find enough evidence to break the case. Eventually, the FBI indicted 7 Klansmen for lying about their involvement in other racial violence, hoping that the pressure of the indictments would force some of the Klansmen to crack and testify about the Moore case, but the ploy didn't work and the indictments were eventually dismissed. The FBI eventually closed the Moore investigation in 1953. The case has been reopened 3 times, in 1978 by Brevard County, in 1991 by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and in 2005 by Florida Attorney General Charlie Crist. In October 2006, 3 weeks before winning the Republican primary for governor, Crist held a press conference in Mims and claimed to have resolved the case. Although he said that his investigation found no new evidence, Crist identified 4 Klansmen by then dead as the likely perpetrators. In the next few weeks, however, the Crist investigation was roundly criticized by Moore scholars, FDLE investigators, and newspaper editorial boards. It was largely dismissed as a political attempt to win black votes. When the Moores were killed, the risk to civil rights activists and many blacks in the South was high and continued to be so. According to a later report from the NAACP's Southern Regional Council in Atlanta, the homes of 40 black Southern families were bombed during 1951 and 1952. Some, like Harry Moore, were activists whose work exposed them to danger, but most were either people who had refused to bow to racist convention or were simply innocent bystanders, unsuspecting victims of random white terrorism. For example, bombing was especially prevalent in Birmingham, Alabama in the 1950s, used by independent KKK groups to intimidate middle-class blacks who were moving into new neighborhoods. The state twice returned to the Moore murders but was unable to file charges since most of the men whom it suspected in the crime had died. In 1999, journalist Ben Green published a book based on his research of the case, Before His Time: The Untold Story of Harry T. Moore, America's First Civil Rights Martyr. His research had gone deeply into the FBI files. Green's book was followed by a public broadcasting service show about Moore's life, Freedom Never Dies: The Legacy of Harry T. Moore. In 2005, Florida Attorney General Charlie Crist reopened a state investigation of Harry and Harriet Moore's deaths. The Moores' only surviving daughter, Juanita, encouraged Crist in the efforts to uncover the identity of her parents' killers. Forensics teams combed the former site of the Moores' house for evidence. The site is now within a memorial park. On August 16, 2006, Crist announced the results of the work of the State Office of Civil Rights and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Rumors linking Sheriff Willis McCall to the crime were proven false. Based on extensive evidence, the state concluded that the Moores were victims of a conspiracy by members of a Central Florida clavern, is that what they're called? Clavern? Of the Ku Klux Klan. The investigators published a report naming the following 4 individuals, all of whom had reputations for violence, as having been directly involved: Earl J. Brooklyn, Tillman H. Belvin, Joseph Neville Cox, and Edward L. Spivey. And that's the story of Harry T. Moore and the injustice of his death on Christmas. And that's also it for this episode of No Better Death Holiday Horrors. What did we learn? Don't get stuck on Japan's death row. They'll yank you out of your wheelchair to be hung on Christmas. Check for bombs before you go to bed. Don't be an asshole communist dictator who drives his entire country into abject poverty and debt. And don't play with guns. Don't play with guns. Don't play with guns. As always, you can go to knowbetterdeath.info for all info on No Better Death, links to our social media, show notes, links to the show on most podcast apps, contact info, whatever you need, it's right there, knowbetterdeath.info. If you could be so kind as to tell your friends about the show and leave a review on iTunes, I would be forever in your debt. Also, don't hesitate to contact me on Facebook or Twitter or via email, knowbetterdeath@gmail.com, with any personal experiences you may have with death, show ideas, stories you'd like to hear covered on the show, whatever you got, send it in and I'll put it on the show for you. On the way out here, I'm going to run a quick ad for a podcast I've been listening to, and then I'm going to take you out on a track from my friend Pat Murphy. He's out of Overland Park, Kansas. He goes by the name Twisted Prophecy. He's got a really cool electro-industrial sound. If you like what you hear, you can find him on SoundCloud under the name Twisted Prophecy. I am your most distinguished of hosts, Sick Grayson. Until next time, try not to die.
Hey, Christy, what do we talk about on our podcast?
Well, Ashley, we talk about all kinds of weird stuff.
Like aliens.
And ghosts.
And cults.
And cryptids.
And witches.
And murders.
Yeah, even sometimes murders. Basically, we talk about all kinds of weird shit.
Oh, I already said that.
Oh.
So yeah, if you like weird topics, feminist rants, and the occasional F-bomb, you should listen to us.
We post new episodes every other Monday.
Find us online at thatsweird.org.
And subscribe to That's Weird on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts.